This is Professor Russell James coming to you from Texas Tech University. Welcome to today's lecture from Visual Plan Giving, an introduction to the law and taxation of charitable gift planning. Welcome to Charitable Gifts of Homes and Farms with Retained Life Estates, Part 1, Introduction. This is Professor Russell James. In this chapter, we will examine the somewhat less well-known charitable planning strategy of donating a remainder interest in a personal residence or farmland while retaining the life estate. This topic is useful for two reasons. First, this strategy can be valuable for donors with an interest in leaving a bequest gift who would also like to receive an immediate income tax deduction for their commitment. The remainder interest with retained life estate gift instrument itself is relatively simple, and because few fundraisers or advisors are familiar with this option, it may prove to be a useful niche strategy that can lead to attractive opportunities. Second, this is the simplest type of planned gift that generates an immediate income tax deduction for a transfer that will usually benefit the charity only years later. Typically, the charity becomes the owner of the property only after one or more lifetimes, or sometimes after a fixed number of years. This same concept, a transaction that benefits a charity primarily in the distant future, but still generates an immediate income tax deduction, appears in a number of more complex contexts. This same idea appears again in charitable structures such as charitable remainder trusts and grantor charitable lead trusts, but in those cases the idea is combined with other financial benefits coming back to the donor from the trust. Before advancing to these more complex structures, it may benefit the listener to understand this relatively straightforward gift. In this way, the remainder interest gift with a retained life estate is not only an independently useful transaction, but serves as an important conceptual building block for even more sophisticated planning. As was addressed in previous lectures, a partial interest gift with retained interests occurs when a donor donates some types of rights to property but keeps other types of rights in the gifted property. Remainder interest gifts with retained life estates are exactly this type of transaction. The donor gives a remainder interest, the right to own after death or after a period of years, in a home or farmland to charity, but keeps the right to use the property in the meantime, during life or for a fixed period of years. The general rule is that if a donor retains an interest in gifted property, giving the charity only a partial interest, the donor may not take a deduction for that type of transaction. Gifts of remainder interests in a personal residence or farmland while retaining a life estate are a special exception to the general rule against deducting partial interest gifts where the donor retains other ownership interests in the gifted property. The other special exceptions to this general rule are charitable remainder trusts, charitable lead trusts, pooled income funds, and qualified conservation easements. In many ways, a remainder interest gift with retained life estate is similar to a will. A remainder interest gives the right to someone else to become the owner of property after the death of the current owner or another person, or after a certain number of years. Typically, the donor who owns the property gives the charity the right to own the property after the donor's death, or after the last to die of the donor and the donor's spouse. But it is also possible to set up a remainder interest with a retained life estate in a variety of different ways. Any person or persons can be used as the measuring life, after which the property would go to the charity as the remainder interest holder. For example, a donor could gift a remainder interest to a charity that takes effect only after the death of the donor's spouse, and all currently living children and grandchildren of the donor. Although the charitable deduction for such a transfer might be relatively small, given the likely number of years the charity would have to wait to become the owner of the property, there would still be some charitable deduction. In another twist, a donor could give a charity the right to own the property after the death of, for example, the donor's sister, and then donate the right to use the property for her life to the sister. Many such constructions are allowed, but they are also quite rare compared with the standard approach of the donor retaining a lifetime right to use the property, in other words, retaining a life estate, and giving the remainder interest to the charity. Although it transfers full ownership of property at death, the remainder interest with retained life estate differs from a will in important respects. Unlike a will, the decision to transfer a remainder interest in real estate is not revocable. Once the remainder interest is given, it is immediately owned by the recipient. This can be a tricky concept to understand. Even though a remainder interest might not result in the transfer of full ownership until after the death of the donor, that right to receive the property at death is immediately owned by the holder of the remainder interest. Because this right is immediately owned by the remainder interest holder, it can even be sold. For example, suppose a donor gives a remainder interest in his home to his favorite charity while retaining the life estate. This gives the charity ownership of the right to receive the home at the death of the donor. The charity could wait until the donor dies, and then the charity would become the full owner of the home. However, the charity could instead immediately sell this right to an investor, in which case the investor would receive the home at the death of the donor. The home, at the death of the original owner, will be owned by whoever owns the remainder interest at that time. These later transfers have no effect on the charitable deduction. In the same way, the charitable deduction for a donation of a share of stock is not affected by whether or not the charity later sells the stock to someone else. It is this irrevocable and transferable nature of the remainder interest gift that makes it immediately deductible. Because the charity has received a valuable right today, one that can even be sold today, the donor can take a charitable deduction today even though she retains the right to use the property for the rest of her life. In contrast, no income tax deduction results from naming a charity in a will because the charity has no rights prior to the donor's death. The charity can be removed from a will at any time, but giving a remainder interest deed is permanent. Although the donor cannot prevent the future transfer of these rights from the charity to another buyer, it would be common for the charity to communicate with the donor in advance regarding its plans. In some cases, the donor may encourage the charity to sell the rights in advance so that the donor may see the impact of his gift while he is still alive. For some donors, this is an attractive concept that would be impossible if using a will instead of a remainder interest deed. This remainder interest gift must be transferred by means of a remainder interest deed. Even an otherwise identical arrangement created by a trust or a contract will not generate an income tax deduction. Only a deed will work. This makes the transaction document extraordinarily simple. Using a standard deed form with the transferee listed as, quote, life estate to John A. Donor, remainder interest to XYZ charity, close quote, will usually be effective. The simplicity of this transaction may ironically contribute to its underutilization, as some attorneys may favor more complex arrangements that generate more billable hours. Taking a charitable deduction for the transfer of a remainder interest to charity while retaining a life estate is limited to specific types of property. Only two types of property are eligible: farmland and a donor's personal residence or residences. Any land and improvements used to raise crops or livestock qualifies as farmland. The land will qualify as farmland even if the donor is not farming the land himself, so long as someone is using it to raise crops or livestock. Land being used to raise crops or livestock is farmland, even if its valuation is based upon its usefulness as commercial development property. A donor need not transfer a remainder interest in his entire farm, but can deduct a remainder interest gift in any part of a farm. Using the term farmland rather than farm avoids the impression that the donor's entire farm must be given to charity at death in order to take this deduction. For example, the donor who owns a 1,000-acre farm can take an immediate income tax deduction for giving a remainder interest with a retained life estate in 10 acres of that farm. The donor can identify specific acreage within a farm to be gifted by a remainder interest deed while keeping the life estate, in other words, the right to use during life. But could the donor deduct a remainder interest gift of an undivided share in farmland? In other words, could a donor deduct the gift of a remainder interest in an undivided 10% interest in 100 acres of farmland, rather than a remainder interest in 10 specific acres of that farmland? The answer is yes. Thus, a donor could make a remainder interest gift of 5% of his farmland. The donor could even choose to do this every year for 20 years until all of the remainder interest in the farmland was transferred. Such a spreading out of deductible gifts might be attractive to a donor depending upon the donor's tax circumstances and the ongoing appreciation of the property. Appreciation is important because the value of each gift increases as the value of the underlying farmland also increases. Further, each gift may generate a greater deduction because the donor is 1 year older at each transfer, making the remainder interest more valuable due to the reduced life expectancy of the donor. This is, of course, assuming the typical arrangement where the donor's life is the measuring life for the life estate after which the property is transferred. However, the deduction for such undivided interest gifts may be slightly reduced based upon the cost that a charity could incur to force a sale or division of the property, known as partitioning. Can a donor deduct the transfer of a remainder interest in mineral rights while retaining a lifetime right to use them? If the donor is transferring a remainder interest in only the mineral rights, this will not qualify for a charitable deduction. Mineral rights by themselves do not constitute farmland. Farmland is land used to raise crops or livestock. Mineral rights by themselves cannot be used to raise crops or livestock. However, if the donor is transferring a remainder interest in farmland that includes both the farmland surface rights and mineral rights, this constitutes a deductible gift. Thus, the value of the gift will be based upon the total value of the land, including both surface rights and mineral rights. But this is only available if the mineral rights are transferred as part of the transfer of the farmland. It is also acceptable to deduct the transfer of a remainder interest in farmland where the donor does not own any mineral rights. This has been Charitable Gifts of Homes and Farms with Retained Life Estates, Part 1, Introduction. Join us next time for Part 2, Calculating the Deduction for Farmland.